Hey, Sovereign Wealth Builders, Simon Dixon here, and welcome to another episode of Simon Dixon HardTalk Live. I've been thinking long and hard about what I could do with my time to bring as much value as possible to my listeners. I think we've spent a long time over the years, in fact, over a decade. I think I created the first YouTube video on this channel, I think even before Bitcoin existed. There's about 16, 17 years or so, or even further back, of videos on this YouTube channel. And I've known many people that in that time have achieved complete sovereign freedom. They achieved financial success they could never imagine. I too went through that journey. And I've changed the name from Bitcoin Wealth Builders because Bitcoin was the key in order to exit the system and meet some of these trends. But I wanted to really expand that out to Sovereign Wealth Builders. So as more of my content, I went through monetary reform. Then I found Bitcoin. Then we went through the whole journey of building the entire Bitcoin ecosystem, invested in over 100 companies, tried to build a non-fractional reserve bank instead, started getting people access to Bitcoin company investments, all of that journey, going back to macroeconomics, going through a Chapter 11 bankruptcy, supporting countries like El Salvador, tried to do it in the UK, Isle of Man, different countries. Been through that journey, sold my business, became a full-time investor, and just going through that whole journey, I kind of moved upon to this whole concept of a sovereign wealth builder. But it dawned upon me that we've been so deep in the weeds uncovering the system and the tools of leverage that I may have gone slightly off in really providing solutions that people can follow. Sovereign is not a yes or no. It is actually a spectrum. And it's a continuation subject to the limitations of your jurisdiction, of laws, of the financial products that are available, of your current situation, of your religion, of your family life, of whether you have children or not. And so we could go down so many different rabbit holes in this whole journey of sovereign wealth, how we even define sovereign wealth. But to me, the system is set up to make sure that you're as least sovereign as possible. And so what I want to do is actually define that framework and try and do things a little bit differently. I believe that change is accelerating at a pace that is quite overwhelming for most people. I know, having been through allocating my time to trying to be involved in the anti-war movements, exposing the different complexes, military, financial, technical, having gone through all of that, it really can play an effect on your psychology, on your health. And I can't imagine what that would have been like if I hadn't fixed the wealth stuff first as well. And what is wealth? Is wealth purely financial, or is there more to it? I think it's a more nuanced subject, and I think there's so many different angles we can go down. But when I look back at my blog, simondixon.com, I think I've covered most of what I wanted to cover in terms of how the system works. Because it's only when you understand how the system works in its rawest form that you can actually develop a strategy to win. And so I was thinking, what is the best way of helping people navigate this? Because things are accelerating. And they're accelerating faster and faster and faster. And this idea that we all came up with as a team was to have some short form content where we kind of define an aspect of solutions and things that we all need to do to prepare. And then do it in an interactive way where maybe this becomes like an AMA session. And so if you're not watching this on YouTube, we're going to try that today for the first time. And I want to do this with you. At some point, AI is going to be cloning all of my content. And it's going to have access to significantly more resources in analyzing. And we're all going to go through that journey together. And I think we need to get set up to be able to be prepared for that journey. And I started that approximately, well, I've been at it for 25 years. You remember my story. I started on this journey because my father lost all his sovereign financial freedom. It was the stock market. It was the 2000 dot-com boom and bust. He wasn't sovereign when he was born. He was born in the 30s. He went through World War II, the Great Depression. He was born in poverty. His father was a bus driver, my grandfather, who I never got to meet. He had 6 brothers, siblings. There were 7 of them. And he became sovereign. And right before he was at retirement age, he lost it all to the financial industrial complex. That was 25 years ago in 2000. And he asked me to figure out what happened. So I went through the whole journey. I did the qualifications. I did the university. I did the master's degree in economics. I did the T-boy job at a stockbroker. I did market making job on the trading floor at the London Stock Exchange. I did corporate finance and investment banking. I threw in the corporate towel. I went into monetary reform. I tried to do monetary reform through the political process, then tried to create a bank and do it through the business process. And then found Bitcoin, realized that there was alternative parallel systems in the cypherpunk movement. Invested lots of different companies, lots of different structures, lost money, made money, been through the whole journey, built a business, exited the business, became a full-time investor, did mining-backed securities backed by Bitcoin mining, did a venture capital fund, Bitcoin Capital, and slowly but surely unwound everything until it was solely in sovereign wealth. And by that, I would like to define what I mean by sovereign wealth. And then what we're going to do is, for those that are on YouTube, using the comments, and we'll get better at this over time. We'll take all your feedback in the comments. We'll read through it all. I want to really develop, going deep into all these tools through your questions, through your journey, through me providing answers to the things that you're struggling with right now. And we'll just see how this goes. Each week we'll build on top of it. I'm still getting invited to lots of podcasts. So I want to give a personal message at the beginning. That's what I'm doing right now. Then I want to jump into the AMA, and you can tailor the direction that this goes. We'll try and keep it on track to maximize value. And then we'll just play one of my interviews where, one of my content, so that you can go back through the frameworks. And everything is archived on simondixon.com. And we'll build a community as well. Now, here's my promise. No sponsorship to change a message to meet someone's goal. No monetization where I have to say something that is sensational to beat the algorithm. No upsells, no business model. I freed myself from all of that. And because I am actually as sovereign as one can be. And as I said, it's a spectrum. You'll never be fully sovereign, but it's a journey that we go through. And there's not going to be perfection. There's only every day we're either more sovereign or less sovereign. And there's an action that we can take every day. There's an action we can take every week. And there's an action we can take every month to become more sovereign. So let's really think about what this actually means. And I'd like to just to set the framework. And again, Azad is going to be going through the questions. So you have to be on YouTube using the live chat. And the live chat feature will allow you to ask a question, and Azad will pick some out. I'll try and do some rapid fire ones, some long form answers. I'm not quite sure where this is going to go. We're going to make this together. We're going to do this together, and really just create an interactive journey towards sovereign freedom and seeing how far down the spectrum, sharing our mistakes, sharing our journey, and just watch this whole transition that we're going through with the police and surveillance state, artificial intelligence, but really leaning into it, because there's no option right now. Nothing stops this train, is the old phrase. You're either going to get run over by artificial intelligence, or you're going to be able to, or you're going to have to lean into it. And then we're going to have to change the system from within. Here's what I've learned. I've learned that in following the money, much of what we think is power, our voice, our freedom of speech, is in fact a kind of Colosseum in the Roman Empire to keep you entertained, while real power doesn't really care what you say and they pull the strings. But they do care what you do with your money. And so when you don't have much money, you've got to make sure that your money is a vote. And you're voting for your local farmers. You're voting for taking it out of the system to the best of your ability. And you pull it together, and we create parallel communities. What does that mean? We'll go through that at different parts each week. But at the same time, you've got you're either going to get run over or you're going to lean into it. And here's what I found. They don't mind a lot of people that have very little money and power that just shout and complain and say all the problems, because they know that it pacifies those that don't have the real influence. They capture everybody that achieves wealth, because wealth in itself is a capture mechanism, whether it's a debt, whether it's an equity to Silicon Valley, whether it's a ETF via a exchange traded fund, whether it's subordination through intellectual property and access to revenue sharing, whatever it may be. There is a subordination journey that the system takes us through. But what they don't want is they don't want people. So when they capture people, you become a part of the system. You may notice right now that there's a bit of an internal war between boomers that have real estate, that have 401ks, that are about to retire. They went through all the affordable housing into a mortgage that they could actually manage with their wage. And they ended up with a real estate that benefited from the system. And they ended up with assets that appreciated in value. And they're stuck in that system. They just want to retire without the crash. They don't want real estate to go down, which makes it more affordable for everyone that missed it, because they're captured into the system. And so everything is about maintaining the status quo. And that's a fewer and fewer number of people. And the closer you are to the money printer, the more likely you are to be a trillionaire, because you've got access to the creation of fiat currency, and you can issue the debt that subordinates all, so that you end up with all the hard assets and everyone else ends up with the debt. That's how structurally this system is designed, as I've been sharing for over 2 decades now. But what they don't want is people that are sovereign and wealthy and are not captured into the system, because their wealth doesn't depend upon preserving the status quo. That's a real danger. And I found myself in a position of that, where the more I was able to remove these artificial subordination mechanisms, that you can become quite dangerous, because most people are captured by the system, and so they just participate in the system. But it's actually those people that can buy the lobbies. It's actually those people that can invest in the real movements. It's those people that can actually support their local communities, invest in their local communities, actually make a real difference in terms of their influence and their power and their connections. It's actually those people that are the ones that can make the biggest difference. And it's them that back the bottom up movements, the ones that don't have the capital yet. But they can empower the ones that are actually pooling tiny bits of money, building tiny decentralized communities. And if you look at every resistance movement, it was sponsored by real capital, because those that were just there at the bottom with no capital, no influence, and no resources, they were just being pacified with their freedom of speech. But it was when capital actually comes and co-opts them. And either that capital is good capital or bad capital. It either wants to break the system or maintain the status quo. And I think it's in building sovereign wealth, country level, corporate level, individual level, more particularly, that you can actually back the real things, the real movements that need the capital. And it's these people that are wealthy and willing to speak out that are the ones they don't want. And there's very few of them. So I want more and more of them. And I think that's what we're building here. In fact, the whole system is designed to make sure that you're on one side of this K-shaped economy. School teaches you compliance because school was designed to build factory workers in an industrial age. It wasn't designed to create critical thinkers. It wasn't designed to create people that were outside of the system. It was designed to put you in the system. It was designed to put you in a uniform where you comply. And in that compliance structure, it was sponsored. The curriculum is sponsored by those that wanted you to comply. Then as you go further along, you get into university and education. And we know what that is. I went through that journey. I thought I wanted to create business. And instead, I ended up thinking that, okay, maybe I'll go to university first. 3 years in university today is probably the difference between life and death. Like if you spent the next 3 years mastering and leaning into the areas that the entire globe is turning itself upside down for right now, which is artificial intelligence. Let's face it, nothing stops this. They've won. But what did we learn from Bitcoin? That what the establishment want when they realized we had an open source project where people could exit the system is they created Wall Street financial wrappers so that you give them your Bitcoin, and then they try and make debt instruments and equity instruments and all sorts of instruments to keep the Bitcoin while you get the paper Bitcoin. But those that used Bitcoin in self-custody were the ones that were actually able to influence the system, the ones that actually became sovereign. And they all disappeared one by one. I know many of them. I know hundreds of thousands in my network that became millionaires. I know hundreds that became billionaires. I went through that journey with them too. And it was in the university and college system that we're pushed into debt. Student credit cards, the desire to own real estate, but first you've got to take on your student loan. And with your student loan, this is the start of you becoming a collateralized debt obligation where you're the collateral, you are the product. And then at the end of it, you try and get yourself a job to pay down some of the interest on the debt. And then you are in a lifetime, and then you're trying to keep up with the Joneses because society is telling you who's going to be the most successful after college, university. It's a game of keeping up with the Joneses. And then you go for a better car and you do it on debt and you try and get your mortgage and then you're in debt and you just go through the debt cycle that some people never escape. But the boomers were able to benefit from all the appreciation in the asset, but they went through their whole life paying interest, servicing the bank. And then only if they were co-opted into the business system were they able to create a structure that allowed them to potentially get on the right side of the K-shaped economy. And then they're co-opted through capital. And once they're co-opted through capital, they can enter into these blackmail networks, these capital structures. They work for the investment bank. Rather than the retail bank, you end up working for the investment bank. And it starts through Silicon Valley, venture capital, private equity, and goes up through the whole structure. But it's all a subordination structure. And so university effectively just turns you into a collateralized debt obligation by design. They turn economists into debt dealers. They create false dichotomies between socialism, capitalism, communism, all creations of Western ideology. And they don't teach you that stuff. They teach doctors to be drug dealers. They want you a subscription service. Everything they teach was sponsored by those that wanted you to subscribe and be debt slaves. And that's the fact, that's the workers that they're creating at these college and university systems. Now, maybe you break the cycle and you get into business, but then you end up in Silicon Valley and you're selling yourself for equity and then you're in the subordination structure. But if you end up in an employee, what happens? By design, the central banking system, by design, it obfuscates inflation, where your wages never go up at the same rate of inflation. So when your wages are stuck here and inflation is going up here, then you're subsidizing the difference through debt. Maybe if you, depending on how skilled you are, it's a second job or a third job. Maybe you lose your job. Then you got a disaster, and that disaster means that you can't afford your medical bill. You can't afford the deposit. So it depends on how you play that game, how far down this cycle you go. But your wages are structurally designed to not increase at the same rate as inflation unless you comply and go up the corporate ladder. But this is to push you into the K-shaped economy, because what they want is they want you to have an education that makes you work for a company where your wages are not growing at the same rate of inflation, so that the more you earn, the more debt you can take on. And you just feed the bank, you feed the interest, until eventually, if you get above it, you give them to the financial institution to manage your pension, forced into that. And then they manage your money for you and they get the voting power and capital. Or you end up taking on more debt, or you end up investing. And it's only in those that are able to get themselves in a position where they spend less than they earn. Then they create a consumption economy. And that consumption economy drives people in two directions. You either fall for the psyop and you're more important spending money on Botox, buying your Gucci handbags, making sure that you've got the Ferrari, trying to look like you're richer than you are. Maybe if you are playing a certain game, you end up going down the private jet routes. But no matter how wealthy you get, no matter how good your job is, it's all an optical illusion to drive you deeper into the consumption economy. They want you subscribing to everything. They want you subscribing to therapy. They want you subscribing to antidepressants. They poison your food. They want you unfit, unhealthy, addicted to drugs. This is structurally how the system works. This was to sell more oil through the petrochemical industry, through the Rockefellers, the drugs and the chemicals and the fertilizers. We're seeing that right now more than ever. With the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, we're saying, all right, so some people can't eat if they don't get these petrochemicals. Some people don't get their drugs because it's all built upon this oil and energy industry. So we're driven into two directions once we come down this. We either consume and end up a collateralized debt obligation where all of our credit card debt is for meaningless things to drive the consumption economy, or we drive it into assets and hopefully those assets beat inflation and we get ahead of the curve. But fewer and fewer people do. And so the consumption economy, because it's built upon a debt-based Ponzi scheme, is structurally designed to have that K-shaped economy. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. The more access to debt to acquire the assets, the more likely you are to be able to get on the right side of the K-shaped economy. If you then use that debt in order to look like they want you to look in order to keep up with the Joneses, then you end up a collateralized debt obligation, pretending to be rich, posting on social media so that everyone thinks that you're doing better than you are, while you're in the gig economy trying to figure out where the next paycheck comes from. Each one makes you less sovereign. That is the design of the system. And sovereign, less sovereign, because fewer and fewer people control the capital at the top. And your job in being sovereign is to take away, to go along that spectrum and take away some of these structural dependencies. There are people right now that are sending their children to university, a dead system, where they're selling you these degrees to countries that have been indoctrinated into what that degree will do for you, that turns you into this cycle. Rather than spending the next 3 years getting as much income, skilling yourself to help businesses or people adjust to what's happening in this AI. Because really, we're moving towards, look at the growth in the American economy right now. The entire growth is AI in data centers and all the structural energy and manufacturing that's coming from that. If you take out the AI trade from last year, there was zero growth in America. And now they create an energy crisis to make you sell your assets. Because if you got ahead of this curve and you had some assets, they're now creating a cost of living crisis to make you sell your assets. And then they're putting you in tax traps, jurisdictional tax traps, where there's nothing left. They're engineering collapsing of various markets so that you end up having to pay unrealized gains, taxes on assets that you haven't sold. So you have to sell those assets. They're even doing it right now in the case of the UK. Watch the UK as a case study. They're doing, in the name of pretending that they're helping renters, they're making it where every tenant is a tenant for life. And the only way you can take them out of that tenancy agreement is to demonstrate that you're going to either live in the house or sell the house, with an unrealized tax probably to follow every year, just for owning real estate, where you need to sell the real estate to BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. And guess what? Those with the corporate structure, with the institution, the things that I spent my life setting up, the things that people that I know that beat the game, that remain sovereign, they have access to the loopholes that mean that you don't need to do this. And if you don't play that game, you're just a collateralized debt obligation for the power. And that's where they want you. They don't want people that are sovereign, wealthy, and dangerous. And that's where I think we change the system, because there's no beating the system without the sovereign power. And so they want you locked into jurisdictional tax situations where you can't leave, because you're paying the interest on your debt in an asset that is stuck to the ground, that forces you to say a continual tax slave of that country, where you're saving in a fiat currency that's going down lower and lower and lower, and you're getting on the wrong side of the K-shaped economy. This is modern day slavery. They never abolished slavery. They just changed the game with the central banking system. And people in the global south that are impacted by all of this resource extraction to drive this consumption economy, they're in a really bad position. You know, all of their assets are being pirated by this same system. We're seeing that around the war zones. And then the people over here that are meant to be in the developed countries, the rich countries, they benefit from all the cheap resources that were stolen from those that were never able to benefit from their resources thanks to these IMF systems. And now they're not be able to keep up because of the K-shaped economy. So they're saying, why don't I go over there? Because no one's playing the game right, because they're not sat down. No one actually gave them the tools that they need to be sovereign. I had to figure them out. It was only because of Bitcoin that it gave me the breathing space to figure this out. It was only because I was investing in so many companies, or I was building a business that used jurisdictional arbitrage. The only reason I figured that out is because I got chased out of my country, because the regulators didn't want us to build a non-fractional reserve bank. Now, that's a blessing in disguise. If that hadn't have happened, we wouldn't have figured out how to use jurisdictional arbitrage in order to play the game of the wealthy. And that would have been a very different thing, a very different journey. And so sometimes what you have to do is you have to lean into the system, and you have to play the game in order to change it on the other side. Now, sometimes you can take your small amount of money and just exit, and you need to do that every month. Here's the secret. Here's the secret they don't want you to know. They want you to believe that wealth is about gambling and picking the next cryptocurrency and playing on a prediction market or building an OnlyFans business. They want you believing that you need to make all your money in a year, when here's the reality. Most people vastly overestimate what they can do in 1 year and underestimate what they can do in a decade. if you decide to commit to a sovereign wealth plan, as long as this channel has existed since Bitcoin was $3, I've told people own more Bitcoin this month than the previous month. When the price goes down, you get more Bitcoin for your fiat currency. When the price goes up, you feel wealthier in fiat value, and then you can use that in order to build your sovereign strategy. I've been saying that for as long as this YouTube channel existed, when Bitcoin existed, and I was even saying it before then, but with different assets. It would have been gold or whatever in those days as well. So they want you having a 1-year plan rather than a 10-year plan, because what it requires to build sovereign wealth, it requires a long-term plan. There's no speeding this up. When I was chased out of the UK because they wouldn't give us our license and we had to move to Hong Kong, and the only regulator that would give us a license that we needed to play, to engage with Bitcoin companies was Cayman Island. And when I realized how Cayman Island works and what it's for and what Hong Kong is for, where there are jurisdictions that deliberately facilitate, you learn the structures of the wealthy, and they don't want you to know those things because that makes you sovereign. That makes you dangerous. That makes you wealthy and outside the system. They want you subordinate to the system. So when I think about it, and I want to go through just 3 more things before we start doing the AMA. And then we're going to play one of my interviews later, for those that want to, I'll continue doing those. I wanted to cover 3 things that, in my observation and my journey, leads to you either being less sovereign or more sovereign. And these 3 things, I could create whole courses on each individual one of them if we do that together, and maybe answering your questions, we'll do that. Maybe I'll lean into AI, and AI will be able to pull all this content together into something very useful. In fact, we'll do that on simondixon.com. Again, no business model, no upsell. I don't need it. I figured this stuff out that I'm teaching you to make sure that I'm never in the position that I was in when I started 25 years ago. A debt slave to the system, educated to the hilt, good career, ambition, but just not knowing the rules. And having to lose a shit ton of money in order to understand the rules, and even almost going into bankruptcy, defaulting on my debt in order to accumulate assets, and making every single mistake under the sun. So I can share that with you, because here's the thing. On social media, they're going to hold you like making mistakes and doing things badly is a bad thing. The more mistakes you make, the more wiser you get. But at the same time, there are people out there that can show you the mistakes, and you'll probably still make them, but at least you can come back and understand that comes from real wisdom, real experience. It's often in our most painful experiences that we learn the biggest lessons. And sometimes you need to learn that way. But hopefully I can make a difference, because I made a lot of mistakes in that 25-year journey. And I want to continue doing that. So what are those 3 things that make the difference between sovereign and non-sovereign? Again, it's a spectrum. You cannot get this perfect. You can only get more sovereign or less sovereign. And you can ask yourself that question every day, every week, every month. Are my actions making me less sovereign or more sovereign? And it will be a continual journey as well. One is your liabilities. How do you accumulate your assets, your wealth, your consumption? And there's only a few ways in which you can do it. Outside of income, which would be another question, you either take on debt. And when you take on debt, I want you to understand debt for what it is. It is a mechanism for levering you. And you need to get that right. You need to get that right. Because if you are in debt to the kilter, you are not sovereign. You are a collateralized debt obligation for the financial industrial complex, and you are the collateral. And they'll take your home, they'll take everything. So debt is one mechanism. Whoever writes the check controls that part of your sovereignty. Your house is not your house. Your house is owned by the bank, and you're able to rent it in exchange for paying your interest through a mortgage. And whether that's a tracker or a fixed mortgage determines what the affordability of that is for you. And that's a debt trap. It always has been a debt trap. What about equity? Equity is the mechanism for productizing your assets and selling shares so that other people can put capital into a company, securitization, and then they get a piece of the upside, and it's a profit share, as it were, or it's a upside and downside share. The value is accrued in the shares, but they get a voting right, non-voting or voting, and how you structure it. How you structure your debt and equity depends upon the amount of leverage and how sovereign you are. There's not an amount of money that anyone could lend me right now because I've got all of the value in the equity where the assets are paying me enough to never need to borrow again. But if I ever do, and I did once, and some people will know, I spent 2.5 years supporting 650,000 victims of the Celsius bankruptcy because I thought it would be a good idea to take a tiny percentage of my Bitcoin and give it to a structure called Celsius and experiment with borrowing against it. I put significantly more capital in there, and then I decided to put some more Bitcoin to pay the interest as well. It was a tiny percentage of my wealth. For some people, it was 100% of their wealth. That company was a fraud. It went into bankruptcy. I ended up the top 10 creditor. $45 million worth of Bitcoin in that bankruptcy case. And fortunately for me, it was an experiment. For others, it was everything. Like my father, when he lost all his savings, that took many people down to zero. They lost all their Bitcoin from it. And so equity is another mechanism for being subordinate to those that own the shares. And you have to play that game right. You have to understand it right. Other things are profit share contracts. Maybe you have intellectual property and you decide that somebody's going to get a profit share in it before some kind of contractual relationship. Now, debt means that there is no shared responsibility. Debt is higher in the cap table. You know, it's normally higher than equity holders. And profit sharing agreement can be contractually above debt or equity. But understanding those three things, you need to understand what equity do you hold, what debt do you hold, who do you own it to, and who are you subordinate to? And what is your plan for either being comfortable with that relationship or becoming more sovereign? There's share buybacks, there's various other things, but you need to understand these different mechanisms. That's concept number one that determines how sovereign you are. As I said, it's a spectrum. Concept number two is jurisdiction. Most people are born in a country, they have the same country as their passport. If they set up a company, they set up their company in that country. If they have a job, they have that job in that country. They decide that they're going to become a taxpayer in that country. Maybe it's corporate tax and they can play the game, or it's income tax, or it's capital gains, inheritance tax, all the different types of tax. Now wealth tax, now exit tax, tax. Some people just say, because I was born in a country, I'm going to do all of that in one country. That is designed to keep you connected and stuck and non-sovereign to one jurisdiction. Then it depends on what's the legal process in that country. Then it depends how useful that passport is. Does that passport allow you to travel freely? Or is it one heck of a process? Or does it leave you into sanctions and all sorts of seizure of assets? That's luck. But when you become more sovereign, you're able to pick your passport. Now, that's a rich person's game, granted. Sometimes you can use jurisdictional arbitrage in order to purchase assets, and it gives you access to legal and tax arbitrage and various other things. It's a lifetime journey. In my journey, I was born in the UK, but across all the different structures that I've used in my lifetime, Hong Kong, Cayman Islands, British Virgin Islands, Isle of Man, Mauritius, El Salvador, different types of jurisdictions over the time. Because sometimes one jurisdiction is great for one thing, But what do the wealthy do? They're a reason why they're a loophole from the system. Just as they want you to put your Bitcoin in an ETF and hold it in custody, but they don't want you to hold it in self-custody, the wealthy still allow self-custody to exist because they want to use it. It's their escape valve. It gives them portability to go to any jurisdiction they want as they become more sovereign. And you use that power in order to negotiate a better situation. Now, initially, you can only do a few things. But over time, maybe you start by just structuring your life as a business in a low-cost jurisdiction. You separate where you pay tax, where you hold your assets, where you work. You locate yourself where there's lower costs. You earn income where there's higher costs online. And you use jurisdictional arbitrage in order to make sure that you're able to accumulate assets. And you're able to be given, there's different things, different jurisdictions come with different breakdown. If you go to UAE, you know that the game is that your freedom of speech is cartelled. You don't go to UAE to campaign against the monarchy. You go to UAE because you get all the benefits of UAE. And you stay in UK if you want speech. But what do they mind? They don't mind you having speech as long as you have no power. They don't want you to have speech when you can actually make a difference and you have sovereign power. Those are the dangerous ones. And so they tie you into a jurisdiction and compensate you with speech because you become a debt and tax slave and you're locked into that jurisdiction and you're not able to play the sovereign game. That's the second thing. The liabilities and who you're subordinate to, the jurisdiction, and you can't change that. I am subordinate to various jurisdictions, but I make sure that I optimize the jurisdiction for the different areas that are right for different goals. And that's a long journey. The next is the mix between income and assets. How do you earn your income? Do you earn your income from one job? Do you earn your income in the gig economy? Do you earn income in one currency? Which currency? The jurisdiction and their currency policy and the central bank that sets that currency policy will make a significant difference. Are you taking that income and are you ending up with more debt? Is that debt buying assets or is it consuming? Are you spending less than you earn and investing the different in assets? Because I only know one way to beat the system is to own the assets that outperform inflation. Your bank should only have, 3 months of emergency? You know it's going to lose value. The system is designed where your wages underperform inflation and the money at the bank, any interest you receive, makes you poorer. That's a safety net. Is that bank levering up your funds or is it a community bank? Is it helping your community? Is it a credit union? Do you become a part of the union or are you just using a big multinational bank that's making you poorer and you're thinking that the money in the bank is getting you further ahead because you're adding to it every month and you realize you're getting poorer every month? Is your assets in the system? Who's the custodian? Who's the counterparty? Am I making Michael Saylor wealthy? Am I making BlackRock wealthy? Or am I keeping that in self-custody where I can port it wherever I want to go? What assets? What do they protect me from? These are the sovereign questions. Am I going to be in a position where I'm exposed to one eventuality? Who am I supporting with that? What is my cash flow? Now, what I want to do in this subject, and this is going to be the last thing before we start taking some of the AMA. If you want to ask a question, Azad's going to jump in soon. And we're going to be taking those questions on YouTube. And you have to be a subscriber to my YouTube channel. So head over to YouTube, go over to Simon Dixon. You'll find my YouTube channel. Find this live video and go over to the live chat, subscribe, and then you'll be able to ask a question and we'll pick some out. We'll find better ways of doing this over time. We'll take your suggestions. One of the books that I read, which made a massive difference for me, and you can read this book or not, or I can give you the summary, or you can use AI in order to get a summary. And this is why you got to lean into AI. You can learn anything now. I read a book, and again, Some people think when you recommend a book, it means you're advocating. One thing I really want you to do is get rid of celebrity worship. Celebrity worship is another form of subordination. Like, we have people that help us in life, but sometimes it goes over the top where they become gurus and it becomes some kind of institutional structure that makes you sovereign to that celebrity worship. Very deliberate structure. And so I read a book by a guy called Robert Kiyosaki called The Cash Flow Quadrant. Me reading that book doesn't mean I suddenly start worshiping the guy and, you know, hanging on. And no one should be doing that with me as well. You should question things that I say. But there is a culture which was very deliberate and a deliberate of always looking to other people. There is respect for people's work, but we are but humans, imperfect humans, and we all will disappoint you with some of our views and our imperfections. But I read a book by a guy called Robert Kiyosaki called The Cash Flow Quadrant, and I reviewed it recently and realized that was the journey that I went through very specifically. I'm going to summarize it for you. It talks about how income is generated through 4 quadrants. One of them is employment. And so most people start there. They build their experience through their first job. But you become the least sovereign in that situation. Then you move to what's called self-employed. That's where you may have a consulting company or you have more than one client. And I went through that journey. So I built my experience in becoming a T-boy as a stockbroker. Then I got a job working as a market maker on the London Stock Exchange, learned trading. And then I worked in corporate finance to learn how raising finance capital markets work and the different games that kind of laid a lot of my experience into understanding how the system works. But then I went out and took that experience and structured it. This was before artificial intelligence, where now you can effectively use artificial intelligence to become, you know, multiple different types of incomes by leaning into the artificial intelligence trade. We've all got to do that right now. The economy is being split into 2. It is the laborers that are building the AI infrastructure, whether that be energy, whether that be metal refinement, whether that be building data centers. That's all the growth. The whole world is being flipped upside down on every commodity, rare earth mineral, semiconductor chip, a component, helium that cools the chip, the whole infrastructure, building the buildings that host these data centers, the water supplies, the rare earth minerals, all the metals, the software, the energy, the electricity, the renewable energy, the wind energy, the solar energy, the hydro energy, the nuclear energy, the electricity, the different types of applications that are being built on top of it. We flipped the whole economy to lean into that. And those that are building the software and utilizing it in order to become more productive. There is every single business in the world that needs to adjust to that reality, and every individual that needs to adjust to that reality. And you're either helping people and businesses adjust to that reality, but you need to earn your income through follow the money where everything is going. That's where all the money is going right now. The hard laborers that are building that, and they are going to replace it all. It's going to be artificial intelligence and robotics that removes all the human capital. That's either going to take us to a world where we end up in a utopia, where money becomes less relevant and technology serves us, or it's going to have both, where we enter into a dystopian world on universal basic income, building a police and surveillance state. But I remember the Bitcoin experiment. That's what happened to those that ended up in custody. But those that held Bitcoin in self-custody, using Bitcoin as it was designed, running nodes, got to fight back against the system by exiting the system. The same will happen in artificial intelligence. Running our own LLMs, taking away censorship from those powers that want to use it for a police and surveillance state, and building the parallel localized communities that are able to take advantage of that with these localized parallel economies that Bitcoin and Lightning Network will empower and allow people to exit the system. We're going to have to go through all of that together, investing in the farmers, the supply chains, and everything. But that's about building a self-governed community, self-employed, looking around you. Firstly, it starts with you. Am I building more sovereign power for myself or less sovereign power every day? Then it goes to your family. Are we collectively the decision of who you marry and the children you bring up is probably one of the most biggest decisions you'll ever make. You can either go down a divorce, something that takes away significant assets from you, something that drains you and mentally destroys you because you made that wrong decision. I was blessed. Myself and my wife, we became a team. We built everything together. We had nothing in the beginning. We were in debt together and we became sovereign and independent and financially free together. And that decision of that teamwork is probably one of the biggest decisions you'll ever make, one of the biggest assets and decisions. What is it that you need to become in order to be a key asset of the type of marriage that will not just double, quadruple, but infinitely expand your ability to become sovereign? And so the income comes from employed, then self-employed. Then what happens is, and I went through that journey. So I left investment banking in 2006, and I started to go into monetary reform. My initial go was to help students change the financial system from within the system. And I would provide consulting contracts, advice, various other things, build wealth. Took me to the first Bitcoin conference, ended up deeper and deeper into debt, as I said, but defaulted on some of my debt, bought my first Bitcoin, and then made a pledge that I will pay myself first whenever I get that income, and that income will go into building assets that outperform inflation. And at some time I was worse. Sometimes I made bad investments, but every single month I ended up with more assets. And initially started with an asset where I could do it with $10, and then $100 and $1,000 and $10,000, then $100,000 as your assets expand, or wherever you get, wherever you go. But eventually you need to put yourself in that position. Once you're there, once you succeed in the self-employed game, you can start to build a business structure. And that business structure is to build assets that generate income and build assets that help you build a system that works without you. And that's what a business is. And so initially that business was meant to be a non-fractional reserve bank. It ended up being a system for helping people accumulate wealth in Bitcoin, invest in Bitcoin companies, create lots of different structured products that helped the sector. I didn't even realize it, but we actually at Bank to the Future ended up creating the BlackRock for Bitcoin companies. We ended up with the voting rights. We ended up supporting shareholders in structures that they couldn't get access to. But we tried to do it for good rather than evil. But eventually we realized that was taking us down, building the police and surveillance state, because it was getting us deeper and deeper into subordination structures. The companies that we invested in became Coinbase, became Robinhood, became Kraken, became Bitfinex, who created Tether. These are like multi-billion-dollar companies. Like, we invested $2.5 billion across the decade to support the industry. And as those companies became public, they became slaves to their shareholders. They owned less of their company, and they ended up serving the agenda of Wall Street. They ended up, working for the financial industrial complex. They ended up Bitcoin treasury companies. They ended up creating stable coins. And guess where it took you? Because the solution was Bitcoin and self-custody all along, you end up always trying to find a way of creating a product on top of Bitcoin that no one needed. So it will either be a new shitcoin, it will either be a new mechanism for getting people to custody their Bitcoin with you, it would be a Bitcoin treasury company, a new form of whatever it may be. And I saw that journey. And that's why I ended up selling the company, the operating company. But we ended up keeping the assets to manage them for our community and network, our family office, as it were. Used all the different things in our own sovereign journey. But that business ended up becoming the fourth quadrant, investor. An investor is where you own enough assets to cover all your income, where you then become an investor and everyone's pitching you for finance. And everyone's trying to get you to invest in their debt or their equity or their profit share or their farm or their community project. And that's where everyone needs to be truly sovereign. And that's the same for a business and the same for a country. Now, most people do that in reverse. They end up subordinate to Wall Street. They end up buying assets that make them more subordinate, taking on more debt. And the more debt you have, the more you're in control, the more someone can structurally rug pull you, the more you can use leverage in order to make more. But that's the gambling trap. And that's how they get you. And that's where they can rug pull you. So employed, self-employed, business, investor. That's the quadrant. And over those 25 years, I went through that position where I can be on YouTube right now and I can turn the monetization off. Someone can come to me right now and say, Simon, I'd like you to push into Bitcoin treasury companies or getting them to do Bitcoin backed loans. And I can say no. Someone can come to me and say, hey, why don't you push everyone into this business? And I can say, no, I just want to say what's right. Someone can say, hey, why don't you use your YouTube channel to pitch people into your business? And that's what everybody is doing. No monetization, no sponsorship, no upsell, no business. I've been through the journey where I had to do that. You have to do that when you have fiduciary duty to shareholders. And everybody does as you go through this journey. But the end result is to become where you have sovereign wealth. And that's a journey. That's at least a 10-year project. But it starts with simple. What's the one thing I can do today? I need to put myself in a position where I spend less than I earn. And even if it's $10, rather than paying the debt, I buy $10 worth of Bitcoin. And then go from there. And initially you'll buy Bitcoin the wrong way. You'll put it in the wrong structure. You'll end up getting hacked. You'll invest it in a shitcoin accidentally. You get it wrong. And that's the journey that we go through in sovereign wealth building. But you have no choice. You're either going to end up on the right side of this trend, or you're going to end up where they want you to go. And where they want you to go is a dark place. As I've often shared on this podcast each and every week. And I can take you down the darkest places because I know how all those structures work. Because I don't listen to the shit they're selling me. I don't listen to the media. I don't listen to politicians lying to us. I don't listen to the celebrities that are trying to get me to purchase something because they're sponsored by an agenda or pushing me down a particular business path or using the algorithm to say the right thing, or at the very worst, blackmailed by Jeffrey Epstein and a similar blackmail network, having to work for a lobby because they need to get their check, because they're stuck in the non-sovereign system, exactly where they want you to be. Rich and in their system, or poor and in their system, but not rich and sovereign. That's how we change the financial industrial complex. That's how we take on the military industrial complex. That's how we create the alternative decentralized technology that takes on the technical industrial complex. That's how we win. We win with our money. Now, eventually we'll end up in a system where maybe money's irrelevant. And maybe the transition between that is that AI uses programmable money, but we know where it goes. Central bank digital currencies, stable coins, or you will own nothing and be happy giving BlackRock your system. And what is BlackRock doing? They're creating IOUs every day, $14 trillion of IOUs with $25 trillion of Aladdin technology to manipulate markets. But what's on their balance sheet? Actual assets, real estate. commodities, the actual Bitcoin. What are the central banks doing? They're printing money so that they end up with the gold. They're dumping the treasuries all around the world right now. The Fed is going to be the last buyer of the treasuries, and that's your share of the national debt. And that's going to create more inflation, and that's going to drive your wages lower until they engineer an energy crisis where you can't afford anything. That's what this global reset is. They want you to sell your assets because they want your assets, and they want you to have an IOU so that you are a slave to their system. And that's what we need to resist against. And it starts small. And that's what we need to build together. And so those are all the different introductory concepts. Now, over the weeks ahead, I could take just one of those and dig deep. But I want to do that with you. So why don't we spend the rest of this time? Azad's going to jump in right now, and he's going to pull out some of your questions. And we'll figure out better systems for maybe voting on questions in the future. Maybe we'll figure out all sorts of stuff together. Please do give your feedback.
A question from Ron Ohems. What do you think about the accelerating development of AI and robotics and how they influence the job market and therefore the economy?
Yep. So I covered that a little bit in my intro, but we're definitely moving into a police and surveillance state where every job is going to be replaced by AI and robotics. And we're going through a transitionary phase right now. And even if that doesn't happen, even if you're skeptical about it, if you spent the next 3 years, rather than going to college or university, leaning into understanding everything about AI and robotics or a niche. So maybe you're a specialist in marketing. So specialize in marketing AI for a particular area and help your sector, your particular area, and you just add additional income or whatever it may be, and you use AI in order to become more productive, nothing stops that. If you're going to be one of those people that fight against this trend, you're going to get run over. There's no fighting against it. You have to utilize it because the greatest powers in the world are driving us in that direction. Now, we can make it more decentralized. We can create communities that beat the system. But there's nothing that stops it. You have to become an expert in utilizing your skills with AI and robotics, whatever your skills may be. And you need to start today. Because there's only going to be two types of people. Those that know how to utilize AI and robotics, and those that are slaves to AI and robotics. And trust me, they're not going to treat you well. Elon might call it a universal high income, but let's call it what it is. A stable coin, programmable money, police and surveillance state where you get just enough income to serve the very same system that you've always served. And that's why you need to develop at least 3 years, 10-year strategy to leaning into that. It changes everything. And you definitely can't be one of those people that protests thinking that you can stop it happening or you can regulate it. Nothing stops this. You've got the Chinese Communist Party. You know what? There's even a structural rug pull built into the system. The entire US economy grew just on building data centers. No growth. It would have been almost negative growth without data centers. Then we know that the capex that they're spending, the billions of dollars that broke the private credit market, the IPOs that are now, all the private investors are getting all the returns. And when they IPO, it's going to be $1 trillion above for Anthropic or OpenAI. They're doing $1 trillion secondary market trades, knowing that they're going to dump all of that stock. Why? Because what's around the corner? China has built an AI ecosystem that works on Huawei connected to DeepSeek that can get 90% of the same result at 9 times more efficient and less cost. All of that capex cost is structurally ready to be rug pulled. And they're going to build in fiscal dominance growth based upon an AI economy that structurally doesn't work. It's just like the gold market right now. Shanghai is ending up with all the gold. London is losing all of the gold because they built derivative contracts where there is significantly more IOU gold and IOU Bitcoin and IOU silver than there is the real thing. And the only way they keep that scam going is by building ETFs where you don't ask for the actual asset, but the central bank gets it and BlackRock gets it because they know that it's going to be rug pulled. They know that. They want you to have the IOUs while they have the real asset. And laws being written in order to do that one day. Structurally, the reason that sanctions exist, the reason they still want sanctions on Iran and sanctions on Russia is because if you want to buy oil from a sanctioned country, you have to use gold. That gold and those corridors exist in UAE and Hong Kong. Those go to Shanghai. And the way that they get there is you take your dollars if you're trying to buy Russian or Iranian oil at a discount, and you buy gold. And those sanctioned circumvention corridors exist via UAE for Iran. And we're meant to believe that they're at war with each other right now. Because they end up in Shanghai, who doesn't have any paper contracts. And they have capital controls to ensure that the gold stays in Shanghai, but they give you an integration into SIPs. And 110 countries have integrated into the Chinese payment system so that they can get their imports from China playing this arbitrage trade, knowing that when China wants to rug pull the West, when transnational capital that is all aligned, when transnational capital wants to rug pull the West, they've got the AI trade and the gold. And America and the West and London and New York have the derivatives and the IOU contracts and the expensive capital expenditure, artificial intelligence. Now, China doesn't want to rug pull the economy right now, but why do you think they're transitioning the world to multipolarity? Because while the world thinks that America's dominating the world, transnational capital is asset stripping the West. And that's why everything's getting worse in the West. And they're saying we're going to use the global South as our labor, and transnational capital that comes from the country that has the currency that is devalued in order to make their exports cheaper and is selling their treasuries to invest in the global South through the Belt and Road Initiative, has their currency effectively backed by gold, while the West has their currency backed by debt. And therefore, the only thing left is to build a police and surveillance state on programmable stablecoins, social credit scores, and artificial intelligence. Which is why the Trump administration works for that technical industrial complex. And that's why everything's going to get worse in the West. It does not get better. You have to be on the right side of the K-shaped economy. And you have to use jurisdictional arbitrage, and you have to diversify your wealth over time as you go through this sovereign journey that we can go through together. So what do I think about AI and robotics? It changes everything, and you need to adjust to it today. And even if what I think happens doesn't happen, you'll be way more prepared on the other side as if you take it seriously. And when they want to structurally rug pull, Shanghai's already built all the infrastructure. If they want to take down the US military right now, they just say no rare earths, done. And transnational capital's on board with it. That's why they're diversifying all the capital to the countries that have the commodities, the rare earths, and allowing them to build their own mix, fix, and ticks. Military industrial complex, financial industrial complex, and technical industrial complex. Diversified around the world. What else has UAE got? It's come out of OPEC. That kills the petrodollar. It's also got access to the Federal Reserve dollars, FX swap line, so it doesn't have to sell its debt or equity. That is the death of the petrodollar system. It also built a system to circumvent SWIFT called Enbridge, which was created by the Bank for International Settlement, that connects together through central bank digital currencies, China, Hong Kong, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Thailand. And through the gold markets, that connects to the rug pull infrastructure in the West, the gold markets, and the sanction countries. That's why they're utilizing what we're witnessing right now to create a global reset. Why? Because they need to justify the money printing. They're pricing everybody out of the market. The poor drop off through famines. The middle class get priced out of all their assets and they sell their assets. And the concentration of wealth goes up to those that control the assets. And then what are they going to do? They're going to launch a universal basic income powered by robotics and artificial intelligence for the rest. But in order to do that, they need to engineer a manufactured crisis. So they're repricing 50 commodities by closing the Strait of Hormuz after COVID, after the Russia-Ukraine energy crisis, after the global financial crisis, after long-term capital management, after the dot-com boom and bust, which concentrated all the wealth into the financial industrial complex, into the FIC. And they know what the end game is. The Fed buys all the treasuries that every central bank is selling right now. The Fed buys them through the big print, and that big print needs a story. What is the story? For national security, because China is creating artificial intelligence at a fraction of the cost, we need to print $7 to $10 trillion in order to win the AI race and put data centers in space so that you can fund your police and surveillance state. And that big print will bail out because there is a structural rug pull beat into the system. DeepSeek just raised finance at $45 billion. OpenAI needs to sell a subscription and raise finance. And what are they doing? They're doing secondary trades at $1 trillion for something that is 9 times less efficient than the infrastructure they built on China that works off renewable energy as well, every type of energy. So why did they push up the price of oil right now? So that everyone can diversify, sell the oil expensively, price everyone out of the market, and do the global reset. You think they want the Strait open? There's a deal already negotiated, but there are powers in different structures that don't want a deal to be done because they're manufacturing this crisis and this global reset right now. And the next year is going to be rough, really rough. And so you need to lean into this AI and you need to lean into this robotics and you need to increase your income and you need to hold it in hard assets. And it starts today. Own more Bitcoin this month than last month, and then we'll work up from there. Figure out diversification, jurisdiction, all the other things, arbitrage. But get this right, because they want you in a position where you're outsourcing all of this to artificial intelligence.
There's a question from Rafa. Since it seems inevitable that the big print is coming, wouldn't it be better to keep some depreciating liability like a mortgage instead of using Bitcoin or gold to pay it off?
So a mortgage sits in 2 places. It is your security and your home. Most people think of the place that they live in as an asset. I don't. Once you own it, maybe it's an asset to you. But to me, it is security. And so is your house going to outperform Bitcoin? These are all the different structural questions that you need to figure out. But to me, I'd be building an asset pool depending on where you're starting. I can't give generic financial advice. Everyone's got different situations, different liabilities. Some are married, some aren't married. Some have got kids, some don't have kids. Some are in a country, some are in a war zone. Like, there's no such thing as generic advice like this. But the fact that you're asking the question is the right question. And personally, I put assets into different buckets. You got spending, which consists of security and short-term needs. Then you have savings, which is an asset that outperforms inflation. And I use Bitcoin for that. Then you have investing. Investing is introducing counterparty risk in order to hedge a certain risk and achieve a system where if your savings are gone, you have multiple different outcomes. Some people might put real estate in there. I think people can get there, but they need to get more simple initially. And then you have contribution. I personally believe that allocating your capital for good may not be the best investment initially in terms of financial raw hard numbers, but it has a spiritual deposit that gives you 10 times return by allocating your money for good rather than using it for evil and bad. Sometimes you will need to use the products of evil in order to exit the system. I personally you can use a couple of strategies. One, you can leverage debt, knowing that you're making the bank richer and you're supporting the financial industrial complex, or you can do it where you exit the system. And Bitcoin in self-custody gives you that exit. I don't know what's right for you, but you have to make those decisions and you have to stick to a plan. And at this bare minimum, whatever your other plans are, have it where you own more Bitcoin in self-custody this month, for next month, for the next 10 years. Have an allocation for that.
Hi, what can average European do to avoid what is coming in EU, but still wants to stay within Europe, to move to Norway, Switzerland, or where?
Yeah, so I'm very bearish on the European Union. The European Union was a project for the Bank for International Settlements. And I believe the colonial techniques of the past from the last 400 years that were done across the different European empires and the American empire in a multipolar world are coming home. And so when you need to compensate the military for the fact that America and the European empire doesn't rule the world right now, you need to give transnational capital compensation for their military profits from war. War never stops. And the Russia the story, I believe, will continue for at least another 3 years in order to justify military profits. Particularly now Hungary has been regime changed, which Russia and Israel used to buy in order to get in the way of things like taking Russian money and sending it to Ukraine for the military industrial complex and the corrupt network that profits from war. There are countries which have sovereign wealth funds. Those sovereign wealth funds have been co-opted by the financial industrial complex. The most important one is the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund. Now, in order to take those assets, which they managed to keep, they put it in a sovereign wealth fund, and they're able to negotiate with transnational capital and become an important and influential node. For example, Norway were the first real money to boycott Israel. And they de-invested from all their Israeli investments. That's $2 trillion. That's real capital. That's real money. That makes a real difference. They have real influence. However, across Europe, they are implementing policies to asset strip the entire West. This is happening across America. This is happening across Europe. And even within Norway, they implemented a wealth tax. Now, wealth tax is designed so that people have to sell their assets every year in order to pay tax or borrow against their asset. So it has two impacts. It turns them into debt slaves if you borrow against your asset, or you end up selling it and then they buy those assets because you need to sell the asset in order to pay tax. That's happening across Norway. There are different jurisdictions. Netherlands doing the same thing. UK is at the final asset stripping stage. It effectively took significant money from the Qatari, UAE Sovereign Wealth Fund. There was campaigns to engineer religious and migration tensions. UAE was funding like anti-Islam stuff, while at the same time, the World Economic Forum was doing an open border policy. And then Elon Musk and the technical industrial complex were using algorithms to radicalize people, while Israel was paying nodes like Tommy Robinson in order to take those that are significantly impacted by the K-shaped economy and radicalize them into thinking it's the immigrants' fault, or it's the communists in China's fault, or it's the lefties' fault. And it wasn't any of those faults. It was the financial industrial complex that owns all the lobbies of the politicians, that is asset stripping and has a debt-based Ponzi scheme through the Bank of England, through the Bank for International Settlements, through the European Central Bank, and some of the countries like the Norwegian krona that managed to keep a degree of sovereignty, and then that sovereign wealth fund needed to be co-opted by the financial industrial complex in order to negotiate and be a node in transnational capital. So Norway is asset stripping the assets. Netherlands is doing the same thing. Why? Because it's an important node. Remember the Dutch disease, where the whole economy was focused on LNG, and then that killed all the other economies. They're doing the same with semiconductor chips in the semiconductor supply chain. Taiwan, South Korea, Netherlands, and the big consumers of the chips, which is China and America, which now they've built an ecosystem with plugged into Huawei chips. And America's about 5 years away with TSMC and the CHIPS Act to building out data centers across America. And then they acquired Intel in order to be chip independent before Taiwan's useless and then China can take it. Where in Europe is going to survive that? It's very tricky. Poland has decided to become a vassal for the technical industrial complex and the military industrial complex. There are jurisdictions like Spain where if you retire and you've already made it, they give you a degree of autonomy. Portugal has very favorable tax structures in terms of your worldwide wealth versus European wealth, but it's all bad across Europe. And so you need to put yourself in a position where you're in a country where you can utilize offshore structures, manufacture your business, a personal business, and where you can hold your wealth, you can diversify passports, and you can live within a country and build a decade-long strategy. There's a lot in there. I know that. But it ain't UK. UK is at the final stage of asset stripping. You can see what's happening in Norway. You can see what's happening in Netherlands. And you can see what's happening in Ukraine and anywhere they want to use in order to escalate that. Now, Germany's building an independent European military industrial complex. They're turning all the car manufacturing into weapons manufacturing. And so when transnational capital wants to diversify from the nationalistic military industrial complex in America, they're building nodes everywhere. And Germany has become the chosen one after its energy crisis. And what's happening right now? They're using Trump in order to get Europe to sign a $750 billion trade agreement, which involves buying $750 billion of energy from Cheniere Energy, Chevron Exxon, and Golden Pass, which, if you're familiar with my content, is 70% owned by Qatar Energy, 30% Exxon in terms of Golden Pass. And the refinement in Venezuela is going to be done in Texas via a company that is a subsidiary of Saudi Aramco in Saudi Arabia. And UAE is creating those money laundering networks for the black ops between the cheap oil, because what's happening right now, Europe is got no choice but to lean into Russia with its energy, build out renewables for BlackRock's portfolio companies. So it will lean into climate change and various other things. So there'll be expensive energy, but independent energy, so that the FIC can diversify, but they want to engineer a disastrous situation so they can accumulate assets on the cheap. I think that includes real estate crashes, but they want to still use the stock market to decouple from the economy and do that wealth. So you're going to have worse pensions. You're going to have worse tax structures. You're going to have worse benefits in all these different areas. And UK is really the beta test. Netherlands, the next one. And Norway's the only one that managed to maintain a significant sovereign wealth fund, while Germany is getting the military industrial complex manufacturing base. And then eventually, after years of extraction, there'll be a settlement and integration into BRICS. But Europe is set to be basically fully vassal, and the vassal is in the asset stripping stage. So unless you are free and sovereign through the exact strategies that I shared, then you just need a jurisdiction and use ChatGPT or AI to help you understand which jurisdictions am I able to just focus on my local wealth, but structure my global wealth. And then you build from there if you have to stay in Europe. I don't think Europe's got a good future, though.
There are growing concerns in the UK around financial surveillance, digital oversight, and increasing monitoring of bank accounts by officials, especially with AI and data companies becoming more involved. How do you see this evolving, and what can ordinary people do to protect their financial sovereignty and privacy?
Yeah, again, you need to build a roadmap for separating your civilian, your citizenship and your passport from where you earn your income, from your corporate structure, and you need to build a sovereign structure up from there. And you need to do it legally, and there's many different types of legal structures, particularly in UK. If you can change your jurisdiction into some of the islands that were designed for this, there's some islands which are more affordable. There are others which are very high cost structures. You know, the highest and most expensive in around UK being something like Jersey. The more affordable structures being like Isle of Man, Isle of Wight, and stuff like that. But you can use those structures in order to build your base. And UK is no doubt about it. The beta test, if you think about the structure, they do the most extreme tests in the war zones, like the Palestinian laboratory, which is going to be the full-blown 15-minute city, full-blown surveillance state. And then they beta test in different nodes like UK. And you'll see that they frame everything in terms of how it makes sense. So they'll say, in order to protect our children, you're going to have to prove your identity to search your browsers and use your social media. Makes sense if you're a parent, but at the same time, that's building out your social credit score. Banks, and through the Bank Secrecy Act, already have to share all their data through and file suspicious activity reports. And AI is going to automate all of those processes already. So all your financial transactions in the bank are already going down that path. And so what you have to build is you have to build a silo that sits within the surveillance state. And then you build another silo that legally uses jurisdictional arbitrage, Bitcoin and self-custody, in order to legally take those Bitcoin, take self-custody, coin join it, and hold it in a hardware wallet where you can eventually run nodes under a corporate structure where you can legally do that. And then you're free and flexible. And then you can adjust. And that's exactly what happened in the UK. We had this massive billions of dollars of drain because everyone was playing the UAE UK arbitrage when UK announced that it was going to do a non-domicile where it would tax your global wealth. So you need to take the country where you are. You need to understand what's happening in your country. And then you need to understand whether you're going to move and what options are available to you in terms of your worldwide wealth. Start that today and build up.
Can you speak on what you see coming in regards to food shortages?
Yeah, so I think the Southeast, the poorest countries, the ones in Southeast Asia, you can kind of break them into two. There's countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, that historically have massive wealth concentration. They rely upon imports for their energy, and that's creating either they've got strategic reserves in fertilizers or not. But they'll be able to, through higher prices, solve their issues. No doubt. And so they won't be food insecurity, but they will price everyone out of food. So you'll have access to the lowest quality food with the maximum amount of poison at the highest prices. And that's coming to everyone that's on the breadline in a very developed country, because they're trying to price you out and structurally create higher prices. That's where investing in your locals and figuring out your own alternative supply chains, if you're in that situation, group buying in rural areas and working with your community comes in best. Then you got the countries that have structural large amount of wealth extraction from the West, with all the sweatshops like the Vietnams, the Philippines, the African nations, the ones where they were never allowed to use their resources and they were stolen, raped, pillaged by the West so that you could have cheaper products, even though you were on a debt cycle in a K-shaped economy, and both were very bad, not very well off. Each one of those countries in a multipolar world is renegotiating into the Belt and Road Initiative. And some countries like Burkina Faso, for example, they're making it where, and even Indonesia, they're making it where they're saying, we're not going to export our commodities. We're going to keep our commodities and you have to build factories here and you can buy the finished product. And so countries are fighting back as a result of the contraction of the West and the options with the Belt and Road Initiative. And then they're pricing those goods in dollars, but settling with alternative currencies. They're building, those currencies are strengthening as a result of those commodities where people have to purchase those commodities in a local currency. You'll see that all over the place at the moment. I've lost my trail. Okay, so that's what's going to happen. Now, those ones will have food insecurity. And what they did is Trump did a beta test first. He beta tests in Cuba. So when the financial industrial complex said, we're going to shrink America into a regional power and you get Europe and Central and South America, they cut off their energy supplies in Venezuela, started selling them at higher prices to China. So it wasn't about choking China. China had ginormous reserves, so they're fine. And then they cut off Cuba, where the point that nobody could travel, no one could go to hospital, the hospitals stopped working, and they couldn't get healthy food. And they developed applications where people got energy rations. You log into an app and you can get access to your energy via carbon credit type of systems, access to energy. And they started pricing out all of the farmers, which they're doing across America right now, into 4 companies. And so the BlackRock portfolio is acquiring all this farmland while they're developing alternative technology where they manufacture artificial food and give you protein like the World Economic Forum based upon bugs and various other things to get your protein sources. I'm not making this stuff up. Elon Musk's business partner, who's a node in the MIC and TIC, is developing these types of innovations. And so what they're doing is they need structurally higher prices to concentrate up to the large multinational conglomerates while negotiating trade deals that bankrupts all the farmers and local businesses and makes them debt slaves, and they can sell their business upwards into very, very concentrated supply chains. And there were resistance movements against that, like in Spain, where after the last depression, they built like alternative supply chain. In America, they built everything off corn, petrochemicals, using soyas in order to get people into toxic vegetarian food. They're going to be using all of these different things because it's only the wealthy that are going to be able to afford this stuff. And sadly, that's part of the game, the food game. Because what do they want you to do? They want you addicted to drugs and therapy. on a subscription service, paying your debt, being poisoned. You know, when all the alternative energies and alternative types of things all existed, but it was industry. And so if you can afford food, the wealthy, those that have built their sovereign wealth, will pay whatever price they need to remain healthy. But the rest, sadly, are being poisoned. And certain supply chains, the ones that are on the wrong side of the bombs, they end up with famine and population control. It's heartbreaking. But you're going to see that in this global reset. We're going to see more and more of it over the next year. And the beta test was Cuba. The beta test was UK. Initially, you're just getting bankruptcy of cheap flight, so people can't fly. You get higher structural energy prices. You get bankruptcies of small to medium-sized business. We've seen this before. Then you get mergers and acquisitions that concentrate power up to the higher supply chains. BlackRock's asset under administration goes from 12 trillion to 14 trillion. Everything goes up. And the least productive of the population end up without food. And everyone else needs some kind of food rationing technology that's delivered through the slow introduction of your stable coins, programmable money, central bank digital currency, and social credit scores. So if you buy the right food, you get a higher score. If you buy the wrong food, you get penalties on your score. And if you're dependent upon debt, then you can no longer access the borrowing markets at the cheaper interest rate, which perpetuates the K-shaped economy. And then they can algorithmically control that into the police and surveillance state. That's what they will be doing. And that's why we need to resist against that through alternative technology, decentralized technology, self-custody, local supply chains. But yeah, and obviously the media will start playing all of these food insecurities so that the United Nations can recommend the World Economic Forum agenda, and you will own nothing and be happy in order to eat. They just want you only paying the interest on your debt, paying the living cost, paying the energy, and then whatever's left over for food. And then if you've got some left over, they don't want you building assets in self-custody. They want you to give it to them to manage so that they can perpetuate the same control grid. All right, now let's try and do some rapid fire questions, Azad. So I'll give fast answers to as many as we can.
Okay, so we've got 15 minutes and then that will be 40 minutes done, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, living in the UK, I'm concerned about how the government policies could impact my children's future. I can't leave because my heart is in Scotland. How do I best help my kids prepare?
I think you have a very difficult choice. I wouldn't be putting kids to university. I'd be getting your kids to fully leaning to the AI and robotics trade. Really be conscious about what skills they're learning. And you know, you have to make them very technical savvy, because I don't know what age they are, obviously, if they're of that age, but they're going to have to lean into technology. You know, you're going to have to build as many assets because there's going to be that transfer. And then you're going to have to plan your wealth transfer to your kids in the most efficient way possible, because they'll want to tax it all. So yeah, using, you know, different type of structures and making sure that your children are skilled in the right skills, leaning into the right things, and not wasting loads of time on legacy institutions like colleges and universities, which are just teaching you to be the very opposite of what is required to survive today.
What are your thoughts on Australia's future, particularly with rising house prices, low productivity, high immigration levels, and concerns that the economy is becoming too dependent on mining and property rather than producing real industry?
Yeah, when the Europeans genocided the natives and created Australia, it was never meant to be a sovereign country. It was a node for resource extraction. And the people were collateralized debt obligations with a debt-based Ponzi scheme called the Australian dollar. So they're trying to turn you into a nation of gamblers and OnlyFans. And everything that's happening across the West is happening in Australia. Maybe there may be some kind of sovereign wealth fund that's connected to Chinese supply chains. There's a little bit of hedging there, but I don't think Australia was ever meant to be independent. So it's down to you. Forget the government exists. Build your own independent sovereign strategy. You got lots of resources. Build your own parallel economies in the vast land, in the urban environments that you have, and just recognize that the governments are going to become less and less useful, and they're there just to asset strip for the financial industrial complex. And you've got to beat the train. You've got to beat the trend. So Australia is no different, and it was never meant to be. It's just a no to send resources to the countries that want to build the consumption economies and build debt slaves.
When you say follow the money, can you be specific and state exactly which money flows you monitor, how you get the information, and how you interpret what it means?
Yeah, big question. But in general, I spend my life following all markets, and then I share more what I want each week. But I follow the currency markets, the bond markets, the stock markets, the ETF markets, and the different yields on the different bonds, where capital is flowing, and the different structures across different countries, as well as the different blocks that are being set up. So for me, that's just my lifetime work. And if you've been a long listener on my work, you'll probably understand the types of things that I look at and look for. Then you get down into the individual stock level to understand the different indexes, all the different markets. Then who politicians are funded by, and how real structures happen. So there's a lot there, and you'll start to learn it the more you listen to my different interviews and analysis.
Question to Simon. I understand that you believe the right answer is to opt out of this corrupt system itself, but for people who still have to live within this system and earn a monthly salary, I guess the question is, how would one actually do that if they are dependent on earning a monthly salary, but they haven't got the option to opt out of the system?
Yeah, build a 10-year plan, take a percentage of your income, and make sure that you pay yourself first, build your assets that opt out of the system, and then improve your strategy from there. Just own more Bitcoin this month than the last month. Learn how to self-custody. Make sure that a percentage of your income does that, and then get better and better and better and work on a sovereign strategy for the next 10 years.
Will the market ever crash?
The central banks, as part of their K-shaped economy and fiscal dominant strategy, in America, in particularly America, they will push all the value. They want you to end up with all the debt, the bondholders to receive all the yield, and all the value to accrue into the stock markets. And they'll carry that jig on for as long as US treasuries still work as collateral and they can find a new market for that collateral. In the meantime, they're using ETFs in order to diversify away from America, and push it into other foreign stock markets where the birth rates and commodities still exist, and where they have enough of a foothold in order to try and build alternative, more decentralized markets across the globe. They also want to do one global government, which is a technical industrial complex agenda. So will they let stock markets crash? Yes. And markets are dependent upon three things: access to ETF inflows by the asset managers, manipulation of media in order to control the narrative if they are geopolitically and strategically important enough, and the ability for the central bank to print money and funnel that value into stocks. Nothing else matters. And each foreign central bank might sacrifice their currency, and then you have the FX currency side to contend with. And And there may be engineered crisis by the FIC in order to acquire assets on the cheap. But eventually there will be a stock market crash, but that will be the moment when they're fully diversified and they've already managed all their capital outflows. And it's more like a 10-year strategy. And then something severe happens, they'll have their alternative collateral set up before they ever rug pull the US Treasury collateral model, which underpins the petrodollar. But they're slowly deconstructing it. They're breaking the petrodollar, breaking the Japan carry trade in a managed transition, and breaking the eurodollar and setting up FX swap lines across all the other nodes, while ensuring that war gets them as much control over the strategic choke points like UAE, Hong Kong, and various other things.
You mentioned that traditional university degrees may become less valuable in the future. But what about subjects like the humanities, which can develop critical thinking and broaden the way people understand the world? Do you still see value in those types of degree?
Me personally, and maybe you completely disagree, I see no value in spending 3 years in an institution that effectively you could have spent 3 years using AI, leaning into the change, learning through self-learning, and developing the skills that in 3 years, the world will be so radically different at the pace we're accelerating in. And so maybe a degree is something you want to do when you already got a degree of autonomy and sovereign independence. But as a strategy, straight out the door, I think it's going to turn you into a debt slave, and it's not going to provide any value. And it's a technique to ensure that you are subordinate at this stage. No doubt. Time's moving too fast. I don't see how you have 3 years to study fresh and not get swallowed up by the system in this rapidly changing world.
You are part of the middle class that's being obliterated. What would you focus on to make this more stable, other than Bitcoin in self-custody, of course?
Increasing my income, reducing my costs through jurisdictional arbitrage, increasing the amount that I have for investing every month, and then developing a diversified strategy in line with what I want on how I allocate that capital every single month, and make sure that Bitcoin's a part of it wherever you go.
What will the world look like after the reset?
The rich will be very rich, and the poor will be in a police and surveillance state. And there'll be jurisdictions that benefit. There'll be jurisdictions that get it wrong. And there'll be sovereign people that have implemented this, and they're able to port their wealth in self-custody wherever they need to go, whatever the world throws at them. And then there'll be communities that go more and more decentralized, and they'll just opt out of the system, ignore the government, and build their own parallel supply chains and parallel communities, and they'll be fine. There is countries that have been through this all around the world. It's just the West that's finding out this now. Much other parts of the world, they were on the wrong side of the Western bombs, and we were extracting all the resources. They've already been through this. It's just coming home right now and becoming more noticeable to you. So again, K-shaped economy doesn't stop. And if you look at what the World Economic Forum, what those wealthy asset holders want to do, they want to tokenize everything. They want to build social credit scores, and they want to build manufacture civil unrest so they can build police and surveillance states. And it's you, your community, your family, and your mental health and spiritual health and physical health, as well as your wealth in sovereign, that will determine how well you manage it.
How can we bring children to this world after seeing how it works and what future holds? Feeling spiritual pain, even thinking about my kids living in this world after you've told how it works.
Well, what we're going through in the West is 1% of what we put the global South through. And they still had children. They got the highest birth rates in the world because they figured out how to deal with this stuff. and they use that in order to become more of a stronger family unit. At the end of the day, it's your mental health, it's your spiritual health, it's your understanding of morality and ethics. Are you going to be taken deeper into the system and do worse with what you're given, or are you going to do better? And I still believe that life is a test, and the poorest people in the world have children in conditions that are significantly worse. And so your job as a parent is to understand the game and to build your family to understand the game as well, and act as a unit. Why do you think they broke down the family values? Because they knew that you were weaker on your own, isolated, with nobody, mentally weak, addicted to pornography, on drugs, drinking alcohol, potentially homeless. That's complete subordination and slavery. Now, for the rest of the world, there's a massive opportunity. You can lean into this, and I think family is a vital part of it. I think not going at this alone is a vital part of that. And you can either say, how can I bring someone into this? Or you can say, how can we collectively as a family make the most of this, use the arbitrage, become more sovereign, build my wealth, leaning to the world as it is, not as I want it to be, and then use my money in order to make the world as I want it to be, and not become evil in the process, not become perpetuate the same system. And I think that's the test, and I think you will be rewarded for that. Just before we answer the one question as well, Azad, if you could pull up simondixon.com. What we're going to be doing in the future is, in case YouTube takes us down or any of these networks start shadow banning us again, we go through different phases. We're making sure that we can build a biggest community as possible. No agenda. As I said, no upsell, no business, no sponsorship, no anything, no emailing you offers or anything like that. Just building a community so that as many people can go through this journey together. And so here's where we're starting at the basic point. Click that yellow button, and that will take you to a page where you can create a login to the site. If you give your email, I will email you every single week, no offers, just what we're going to be covering, and make sure that if we end up in a platform where YouTube takes me down, we do it in our own platform, and you've got a username and login. And as a reward, there's a section in that username and login. We're redesigning it. We're kind of just beta testing it and pushing these ideas out there. Once you've got a username and login, there's a section in the portal where you can ask a question. Ask that question. Give me some suggestions of what specific content, and we can go a mile deep into it. And you can ask in that section of the membership portal. And next week, we're going to be covering, the topic is going to be determined based upon that. And then we'll also see what we can pick it out of the YouTube. That's just our beta test. That's what we're doing now. And I'd love for you to put in the comments anything you think we can improve on. After this, we're going to be playing one of my interviews that I did this week with a geopolitical analyst called Alex Kramer. And it was on BTC Sessions. I did 3 interviews this week. On my YouTube channel, if you're a subscriber, I'll make sure you get access to those. Upon popular request, I did another session with Catherine Austin Fitz, and I did a couple more as well. So make sure you're following me on X. Also, we use Rumble, and also we post everything on podcasts on Apple and Spotify as well. So I'm not sure which channels are going to get taken down. I'm not sure which one's going to become my social credit score. And also throughout this, I'm going to be training on all the content and all the questions, my own decentralized avatar, so that whatever happens in the future, you can ask questions when I'm not around as well, and train it on all of my content and all of this stuff. We're going to be leaning into all of this together. It's a radically changing world, but there's no avoiding it. So with that in mind, Azad, let's do the one final question. I'll give a quick answer, and then we'll move over to the BTC Sessions interview I did this week.
If governments ever outlaw Bitcoin self-custody, would there still be a way to use it, sell or spend Bitcoin within the system, or would people eventually be forced to hand it over?
A great question. So that's where the law in your jurisdiction matters. There's a difference between you following the law and what you can do. And I can't tell you to break the law. You got to follow the law in the country that you live in. So you need to figure out which countries are likely to do that. Historically, there's been one major country that did it with gold, and that's America. And that was during the Great Depression of the 1930s. It's slightly different with Bitcoin because there's no Bitcoin standard today, and they needed the gold in order to back the gold standard during the Depression. But it's your country and their jurisdiction now. You have to follow the law, and if you break the law, there's consequences to breaking the law. But law enforcement is much more difficult in a self-custody relationship versus a custody. In the case of America, the Genius Act locked in that you can self-custody your Bitcoin. So it's legislation. It would have to go via Congress in the case of America. In the case of China, for example, it's not illegal to self-custody Bitcoin. They have restrictions on trading and mining and various other things. And other countries, they will always want you to have the elite arbitrage because jurisdictions are set up for it. And so if some country tries it, then you have to follow the law. And if you don't follow the law, then there's consequences. But with Bitcoin in self-custody, you have to voluntarily hand that in if you've got it in the right way. And so if you buy it on an exchange, they'll have surveillance system for that. But if you hold it in self-custody and you coin join and hold it in a hardware wallet, which is completely legal in every country I know of today, unless someone tells me there's an exception, I haven't seen one yet. And then if they change that law, there will be a period by which you have to develop your strategy. And if you live in a country where they make Bitcoin self-custody illegal, then you'll have to decide and follow the law and face the consequences if you don't follow that. There will always be, in my opinion, countries that won't do that because the elites don't want to do that. That's why Bitcoin in self-custody still exists. And so that really is one of the real considerations. And then that's why you start thinking about your offshore trust structures, because if you don't own any Bitcoin and your trust owns it in self-custody, and you live in a country where you're allowed to do that, then you don't own any Bitcoin. But the one that will be confiscated first is the Bitcoin in custody, no doubt, because they'll use the custodian to confiscate it. And that's what they did during gold confiscations and various other things. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this new format. As I said, it's a bit of an experiment. We're trying to get more interactive. I gave a bit of long form content. In the future, I'll try and dive into a very short content, and you're going to have a login to the Simon Dixon HardTalk membership portal, and we'll take your suggestions, and then we'll spend as much time as we can. Rapid fire on short questions. Maybe we go dig deep into a few questions. Maybe we'll figure out some kind of system for voting. Please do share your suggestions. We just wanted to get started. And this is what I encourage you to do. Get started. Perfection is the enemy. You're not going to get it perfect, right? You're going to do it badly at first. And then you ask the question, did I do it better or did I do it worse? And hopefully next week we'll do it better and we won't go backwards. So thank you all for joining this. Always remember, you are alive at the most interesting and potentially exciting time in financial history. The dark parts are the dark parts, but there's always a yin and a yang, and you have to use the dark parts and reframe them into the good parts. And that's how we make the difference. Many are going to get wrecked. Others are going to do incredibly well. I want you to be on the right side of that change. And so enjoy the interview. It was my interview on BTC Sessions with Alex Kramer, where we're discussing, I've forgotten even what the topic was, different models for how to model. I think it was how the war ends and who's going to decide, and the different models for what comes next. So I hope you enjoyed the interview, and I'll see you this time next week. Peace.